Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you tonight to our Reading Comprehension Skill Test webinar. If you don't know my voice, I am Dave Killoran, and with me tonight are John Denning, and he and I are going to be running the scenario here and talking about reading comprehension in the skill tests. And also joining us is Adam Tyson, one of our ACE instructors out of Los Angeles. And you're going to see Adam a lot in the chat window, which for me is in the lower left hand of the screen. So if you have questions, we strongly encourage you to go ahead and post them there, and Adam will be able to help you out. And then John and I will jump in occasionally, typically when we're not talking, because although I'm pretty good at the Lsat, I'm not so great at doing two things at once. So I'm going to focus on the talking for right now and really get into our topic for tonight, which is right on the screen right there. But sometimes when people hear that we're going to be talking about reading comprehension and skill tests, they're not really certain what it's all about, and that is completely reasonable. So we're here to really get into that topic, and the whole point of our seminar tonight is to try to give you some tools to self-assess where it is that you are going wrong in reading comprehension, if indeed you are going wrong. If you're not, congratulations, just sit back and enjoy. So the real goal here is to improve performance. And as we talk about those types of ideas, we're going to get into looking at aspects of how you perform and exactly the things that you can do to examine each element. One of the big problems when I'm talking to students about reading comprehension is a lot of times when I say, well, where is your problem? Where's the difficulty in reading comprehension? What they say back to me is, I'm just not good at it, or I'm not a great reader, or I just don't like the section. And those are all valid answers. You know, I'm nodding my head when I hear some of those things. I'm like, I understand. The problem is they're so indistinct. They're so vague and broad that it doesn't give us a whole lot to work with in terms of trying to improve your performance. Usually the only way to do that is to sit down with somebody and watch them go through a passage and say, all right, you did this. Did you realize that? You made this mistake over here. Were you aware of that? All the little things that we can see. The problem is not everybody has a tutor to sit next to them and to work with them and say, painstakingly almost, line by line, this is where you're going right and this is where you're going wrong. And so part of our goal tonight is to give you some of those tools so that you can self-assess. And later on, after you've run through some of these, come back and be able to say, I know exactly what my problem is now. And so as we go through this, that will be a really big goal for us. The other goal is to kind of like paint a picture of how you should be approaching this section from an optimal standpoint, and then to also make it more fun to study for this. So a couple of goals here that, you know, are kind of big, but hopefully are more than worthy of your time here. So to start off, before we get into the individual skill tests that we really want to go through, what we really need to talk about is how to approach this section strategically and really what the optimal approach would be. So I'm going to jump off this home screen and take us to some text. Now, this is interesting. Usually we don't talk about where the text comes from, but I'm going to make a point right up front of saying this is drawn from our Reading Comprehension Bible. A lot of times when we do seminars, we pull information out of our courses. Sometimes we make it up completely new. Those of you who were in John's last session know that I'd made up a drill for circular sequencing games that was like a double stack game, and I made it for that drill alone. In this case, we've drawn all the information out of the most recent version of our Reading Comprehension Bible. So you'll see in the text references to things such as pages and chapters and so forth. That's not a mistake. That's actually how it's designed to be. So as we get into this, what we really want to think about is the optimal approach to this section. This is something that everybody says, well, I just want to get a certain number of questions correct. And I understand that. But one of the things that really runs, I think, students into difficulty is having trouble with timing and knowing where they should be within a section. And all the tests are designed to reveal different aspects of how you're approaching reading comprehension. But if you don't know up front what it is that you should be doing and how you should be approaching it from a timing standpoint, that really makes things considerably more difficult. So what we want to first do is talk about what we consider to be the most optimal timing approach for this section. And then what we call it is the +2 timing formula. Those of you who've seen this, it'll be familiar to you, and hopefully it's an approach that you use. But I want to make kind of like an important point up front, and that is this. A lot of times when people read my books or they are in our courses, one of the things that they see is we talk about the average amount of time in a reading comprehension section or a logic game section or even LR. And in reading comprehension and logic games, the average amount of time that you have is 8 minutes and 45 seconds. So that sets kind of like, I think, a false goal for most people. They hear the 8 minutes and 45 seconds and they're like, I must always do the passage within 8:45. And although it'd be nice if it worked that way, that's not how the section goes. And I think anybody listening to this right now would be like, yeah. There's some passages that you run into where you're like, 8 minutes and 45 seconds would be a dream. It's just not going to happen. And we're aware of that. So when we talk about averages, it's just as kind of a shorthand reference, like how are you in relation to the 8 minutes and 45 seconds? But the problem with that timeline or that guideline, as it were, is the fact that it doesn't account for certain things like difficulty, and it doesn't account for certain things like the number of questions. And so we use a kind of like a shorthand formula that we call the +2. And this is what we use to determine the appropriate or most reasonable amount of time on average for each passage that you would come into connection with on the test. And that +2 formula is right down here in the middle of the screen. And it's pretty simple. It's the number of questions in the passage plus 2 minutes. So it is not that difficult to calculate. We're not asking you to do like heavy math during the section. And after you've done this a few times, you come to a passage that has 7 questions. You're like 7 plus 2 is 9. All right, you're in good shape. It is simple math. Everybody is capable of doing it here. So at the bottom of the screen, what you see is kind of the range of passage questions in terms of like the numbers, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And in each instance, what you can see is you're adding 2 to that. So if you have a really short passage in terms of the number of questions, say you've got 5 questions, that's going to say that probably you should be doing that faster than 8 minutes and 45 seconds. You should try to get that one done in 7 minutes. And so on down from 6, 7, and 8 questions. And typically, that is the range of question numbers that you see. That's everything in modern history. The average number of questions is either 6 or 7. So it really kind of depends on the passage, but those are the 2 most common that you would see. 5 is fairly rare. 8, not all that common either. But I want to point something out down here. If you look at the bottom 2 rows, you might notice something. 9 minutes for the first one with 7 questions and 10 minutes for the entire passage and questions. Now, a lot of times, if you're really kind of locked in on the 8 minute and 45 second idea, seeing this, that it could be 10 minutes, it makes you uncomfortable. You're like, that's too much time. It's not. You need extra time to answer those questions, so it's not unreasonable to expend extra time. Of course, one thing is also missing from this basic formula, and it's missing because there's no way to tell up front, and that's passage difficulty. If a passage is super difficult but only has 6 questions, you're probably going to have to spend more time on it. Whereas if a passage is really easy in terms of reading it and understanding it, but it has 8 questions, maybe you don't need 10 minutes. And so as you kind of use this formula, which is really what we call the optimal approach, if you do this, you typically are going to be right at 35 minutes as you end, and you will have gotten through all 4 passages and all of the questions. So if you use this formula as the goal, it works pretty effectively, but it's not perfect because there are elements that you actually have to account for. Now, it's also the case that for many people, it's really difficult to make this happen. They get lost during a passage and all of a sudden, it's not that it took 8 minutes, it instead has taken 12 minutes and now they're behind. And so one of the things that we really focus on when we're practicing for reading comprehension is the idea of understanding your own personal guidelines in terms of pacing. And that's where I want to turn to next. Take a look at the idea that even though there is this +2 formula, not everybody is going to be a machine who can just pound that out every time. Just like not everybody can do 8 minutes and 45 seconds per passage, nor would you really even want to. I've said many times to people who ask me questions about this, that as I look at this, I always think about the Lsat and the sections as a roller coaster. Sometimes I'm going nice and fast. Sometimes I'm screaming. Sometimes I'm going slow and it's painstaking. I'm waiting for something exciting to happen. So as you think about this, what you wanted to take a look at in your practice is slowly developing what works for you. And that requires a pacing guideline. And each of these pacing guidelines has to be customized to you. You need to walk into the Lsat with a plan. And I always say to people, what you want to be able to do is to attempt, can't always do it, but to attempt to dictate terms to the test. And if something happens during the exam that is kind of like off the plan or off the graph in terms of your expectations, you want to have a plan that is flexible enough to be able to handle that. And so this is something that you're going to have to practice, and over time, you will develop what is your best personal approach. And so oftentimes what I say to students is start with the +2 formula and then adjust it to your personal needs. And that means that my plan for reading comprehension might be one thing, John's might be a different, yours might be something completely different from the two of ours, and there's nothing right or wrong about any of those plans. They fit our abilities, they fit our approaches. And so consequently, if you are going through this, you can't really say, well, what's the right plan? There is no right plan. It's only what works for you. So I think that's a really important point. And what this will help us do is it'll set us up with the idea of how do we actually think about preparing? Because what we're going to come into after this, after we kind of walk through the pacing guidelines a little bit, is how we can improve our performance to make those pacing guidelines better and better so that we can get through all 4 passages and answer all the questions, hopefully correctly. So as you can see down here, one of the things I'm going to say before we kind of get into some of the points of this is we are not advocating that you create something really complicated or strict. I'm not about that anyway. I'm all about loose and easy and being prepared, but also flexible. And so keep that in mind. As we get into this, we'll have to make sure that we have the ability to have it be usable and simple, but also can account for a lot of the different things that happen on the test. All right, so these are some of the rules, I guess I'd call them, the guidelines for creating the guideline, as it were. So, and as I said before, the exact one that you create is what you know to work for you, and hopefully, and really advisably, it's something that you have proven over time through practice works for you. So this is how we go about creating this and actually making it work. The first thing is you need to focus on understanding how fast you can go. We're going to have a test for this that I'll talk about a little bit later. But in order to understand speed and timing, you have to be able to time yourself constantly. A lot of times when people are preparing for the test, they don't want to look at the clock. And I have kind of an interesting view on that. I suppose I have a love-hate relationship with timers. Obviously, when you are about to take the test and you're close to the goal of taking it, you need to have your timer as your best friend. I don't care whether it is a kitchen timer. I don't care whether it's your iPhone. It doesn't really matter to me. You need to have that. However, fear of the clock is a real thing. And if you start your practice initially and you just focus on the clock all the time, it's a huge distraction. One of the things about the digital Lsat that I found most interesting was the way people reacted to the clock up in the corner. they would look at it sometimes, and I'd seen people take tests where they just would stop and stare at it for a second, and 5 seconds would pass. And later on, I would say, "What were you thinking? What were you doing there as the clock counted down?" And they're like, "I don't know. I was just watching it." It's kind of a distraction. And this is one of the things that happens as we work with the various timing aspects. It's really easy to overemphasize time, but there is a balance in terms of your preparation between timing yourself and focusing on instead understanding what you're looking at. But at the beginning, we always say, time yourself a little bit. Let's get a sense of where you are. Let's establish a baseline so we know, all right, it's taking me 5 minutes to read this passage and it's taking me about 5 or 6 minutes to answer these questions. All right, now we know that on average, you're spending 10, 11 minutes completing each passage. That's what we can work from. We're going to try to make that better, obviously, and that's the entire goal of what we're talking about here tonight. But you need to know those things. It does not mean that you have to time yourself every single time you do a question, or that you have to become overly concerned about, I was 5 seconds too slow. Don't worry about individual battles like that. Focus instead on the broad war of getting better and getting faster. So, we know that to do well on the Lsat, it's a combination of you going quickly and also retaining accuracy. So point number 1 here is about learning your speed and becoming aware of it. Don't obsess about it. You got a lot of time to fix this. Typically as someone's studying weeks, sometimes months. So don't obsess about it, but be aware of it. The second thing is this: create a benchmark. Now, I just gave you in the prior screens the benchmark that we typically try to use, which is the +2. I always tell people, especially who are really high on the scoring scale or want to be there, is that the +2 is like the end of the line. If you do that, you leave yourself finishing the section as time runs out. So if you're thinking to yourself, I want to score in the 170s, you need to be a little faster than that. You're going to have to move a little bit more quickly than the +2. It may be that you need to try to focus on, say, a +1 approach. So again, you can already see that we can build flexibility into some of these ideas, and it's not difficult at all. But remember that as you go through this, you want to have an idea of the section benchmarks. This was one of the reasons that the 8 minutes and 45 seconds was so helpful, is because you could easily say, well, at the end of the first passage, 8 minutes and 45 seconds had passed. At the end of the second passage, 17 and a half minutes had passed. You could glance at a timer and automatically know, well, am I relatively on track or behind or ahead of where I'm going? You can use almost anything as your markers. Just don't make it too complex. If you're thinking to yourself, after question 3, it should be 5 minutes gone, and after question 7, it should be, 10 minutes gone, you're never going to be able to follow that. It's too complicated, and you're going to be looking at the clock all the time, which is what we don't want you to do. You should only be looking at the clock a very few times during the section. And the last thing you want to do is to look at the clock and be like, what? And have your mouth drop like, where'd all the time go? That's what practice should do for you. Learn your internal rhythm and your speed. The guideline that you create should also take into account difficulty as well as the number of questions. Now, I've talked about this already a little bit. We talked about the +2 in the sense of if you have 8 questions, having more time for the passage on average is completely acceptable. And also, if a passage is more difficult, you want to make sure that you understand that you have more time. And again, the +2 system is a timing system per passage where you take the number of questions in that passage, add 2 minutes to it, and then that gives you a rough guideline for how much time you should spend reading through the passage and doing all the questions. So if you had 7 questions in a reading comprehension passage, you'd add 2 to that, get 9, and you'd know that you would have roughly 9 minutes. If you had 5 questions, you'd add 2 to that, you get 7 minutes. So it allows you to account for the amount of work that you have to do after you finish reading. All right, 3 more points here, and then we'll dive into what is in some senses the second stage of what we're going to talk about. And point number 4 is really one that I talked about in point number 2 already. Don't go crazy with the details. I know some of you out there are Addicts to the Lsat, and you've been studying for a while and you've gotten more and more knowledgeable to the extent that you're able to say, I have a really good sense of where I'm going to be at these points. That's great. And that's admirable. The point, though, is you can't build in really rigid time markers or a lot of them into this. The test doesn't work that way. If the very first question has a bunch of questions, or the very first passage has a bunch of questions to it and is really tough, it could blow out the entire plan if you don't have flexibility. So don't try to make everything really specific, because ultimately the test won't allow you to do that. The fifth point is use it, work it, make it happen out there. Practice with these ideas. This isn't a plan of what you hope to occur, but rather what you've shown that you can actually do. And one of the things that always concerns me a little bit is when someone goes into the Lsat and they say to themselves, I really hope that things will go perfectly and this is what's going to happen. And I always ask them, I'm like, now I understand that. I hope it goes perfectly too. What happens if it doesn't? Some people are like, all right, well then I'll adjust this or I'll adjust that. Those people will be fine. Other people will be like, well, I don't know. And then I'm like, I'm worried now. Let's talk about this. Let's try to go through this so that the clock and the events of the test don't just blow up your game entirely if things don't work out, or something's more difficult, or even if something's easier than you expected. Sometimes people get giddy early on if the first passage was pretty easy, maybe had 6 questions, and they're like, I just raced through that. And then they start to slow down without realizing that, well, there might be something coming that could be a little bit more difficult. So the way to get around all those things is to practice. Be a realist. Learn what it is that you can do. And of course, on the day of the test, hope for the best. That's what we all want. And sometimes we get it, which is a fantastic thing. But practicing will prove to you what your capacities and capabilities are. And then as you get into the test itself, the whole idea is to know how things are going. I've said to many people that in logical reasoning, I have a personal goal. I want the first 10 questions to be done in 10 minutes. I've proven it repeatedly that it can be done, and I can get through it successfully. So whenever I take a new section that comes out and I'm working through a new Lsat, I already know that's what I'm going to do. You can do the same thing in reading comprehension. You could say to yourself, I want to get through the first passage and have 10 minutes gone. Even if there's 8 questions, 10 minutes is the max, but I want to be on to the second passage at the 10-minute point. Again, that is something that you create based upon your own practice. But if you think about what I've said about logical reasoning, think about how easy that is. 10 questions, 10 minutes. All right. I'm not even trying to force myself to go exceptionally fast. It's fast. There's no doubt about it. But I'm not out of my mind. I'm not like 45 seconds a question. I don't need to go that fast. I would most likely be making mistakes at that level. So I don't want to. This is what pacing guidelines are about. Trying to move you to be as quick as possible while retaining as much accuracy as possible. So create the plan that actually works for you and then use it during the test. So the interesting thing is the ideas that we're talking about here are really built around kind of like the goals. The +2 timing formula is a goal that you should have. Your pacing guideline is something that you slowly adjust as you practice to help you get towards your ultimate goal, which is typically to get through all the questions and answer them successfully. Everybody wants to go 27-0 or 26-0. So the opening discussion here is really built around those ideas. What are you looking to get to? What's the tool that you actually use to kind of like control that time? And what John and I want to talk about next is, I think, what we would both consider to be the more enjoyable part of the discussion, which is, where are these problems and what are the tools that we can use to identify those problems so that we can fix them so we can get faster and get more accurate?
Perfect. That's a wonderful segue you've just set me up with. I appreciate it. And segue is the right word, guys. We're going to do a fairly interesting pivot as we move into the latter half of this discussion tonight. As Dave's been talking to you, it's hugely important that you try to take control of what your ideal or optimal test day experience is going to be, that you come at this strategically. And he's just given you a lot of strategies or ways to think about building your ideal test day, testing things, practicing in advance to know what it is that you would find to be your most desirable outcome and how to track that as you move. But for a lot of people, what they find as they're preparing for reading comprehension is it's easy to say where you're successful and where you're struggling, what you like, what you don't like, but it's often very difficult to determine why. That type of precise self-assessment. These are the things I'm doing right. These are the things I could improve on, and here's how I can tell. And here are exercises, literally drills and things that you can begin to implement to help you improve in a very granular sense. I'm better now at this idea or this skill, as we'll discuss. So I think this is a hugely valuable transition we're about to make. And I'd call it valuable for another reason, too, that I'll briefly mention. Not only have I never seen any of this done outside of, well, PowerScore and what we have created here, but if you're anything like me, studying for reading comprehension on this test can get, let's call it a bit tedious, certainly a bit mundane and redundant, because you find yourself very often doing the exact same thing over and over. Timed passage, timed questions, review, check your answers, do more. And that's important, certainly, to establish those pacing guidelines like Dave was describing. You need to implement that kind of practice just to build your stamina. You need to do that sort of thing, full sections over and over. But I think what these skill tests will give you as a secondary benefit or secondary feature is a way to break the routine up a little bit. This is going to add a little spice to how it is that you can go about doing reading comprehension on a daily, weekly, monthly basis so that you don't find yourself in that same just monotonous drumbeat rhythm of passage, passage, passage. So there's some really cool ideas that we're going to talk about. I'm going to cover a few of these. Dave's going to cover a few. I'll probably jump back in and take a couple more. As 6 or 7 that we're about to move through. And yeah, Sassy, as you're about to see, let's look at the first test. And here's how I'm going to present these, or we're going to present these. The first thing that we're going to talk about, really the first screen of each test, is about how it works, what it is that you can do to begin to implement this specific drill test, as we call them. The second screen that's going to follow up on each of these is then going to talk about the analysis of the results, what feedback essentially you're getting from this and what it tells you. And then I'll even at the end of these, and Dave will too, talk about ways that you can tweak the experiment a little bit, the experience, to vary it up or to maybe even make it a little more challenging if you find that you're being really successful with it. The first test, as you can see on your screen here, is something we call broad versus detail reading. And what that really is about is, what are you focusing on? What are you prioritizing as you move through a passage, through the text of it? Are you focused more on the big picture elements but missing the details? Are you so really bogged down in the minutiae that you lose the big picture, or that you go so slowly it's impossible to ever finish? This is a test that will help to better determine that particular skill. It's about efficiency, ultimately. And here's how to apply it. If you look here, in the middle, you will see the timing that we recommend for implementing this test on a single passage set. And it's a little more generous than that +2 pace that Dave was describing. This test itself is not about speed. It's really about just the analysis of how you read. So what we'd recommend, at least as a starting point, is add 5 minutes to the number of questions. If it's a 7-question passage set, take 12 minutes, roughly, to try to finish it. If you can move quicker, sure, but don't rush yourself. That's not what you're trying to do here. Here's the twist or the catch. In doing this test, in reading the passage itself and moving out of it, go at your normal speed, behave with your normal type of approach. If you tend to annotate or make notes or highlight, do it. The catch here is that once you have left the passage and moved into the questions, however many there are, that passage disappears for you. You cannot look back. And I realize that's a little bit unrealistic for how people are going to perform on test day, but this is about mixing it up, of course. You leave the passage behind and it is gone. You can use your notes if you've written some, but really this is about your recall. This is about your memory. That's also why we give you a little bit of extra time. It's because the questions are probably going to take you a little longer as you search your memory, but cannot return to the text itself. And here's the way to begin to analyze the results that you start to see. It really is about the nature and the types of the questions that you encounter and how you perform on the big picture questions versus the smaller, more specific, detail-centric questions. If you're getting a lot of what we would call global reference questions, things like main point, author's tone, purpose or function of paragraph 3, whatever the case might be, if you're getting a lot of those wrong, you need to completely readjust what it is that you're focused on as you read, because those are the questions that shouldn't require returning to the passage. You should be able to tell me the main point after you've read a passage. You should be able to tell me the tone, author's attitude, what's the purpose of this passage itself. Why do you write this or she write this? You need to know those things. So if you're struggling on the big picture questions, it's an immediate sign that you're not prioritizing the most key elements in the passage, which are the big ideas, the global elements. If you're getting those right, it's a very good sign that you at least have that part locked down. Similarly, as you begin to analyze questions that do require some more specific details, recall of exact points or references being made, if you struggle with those, that to me is a little less concerning through this, but it would at least be an indication that you're not being perhaps attentive enough to the key elements, the key specifics and details that are offered. If you're getting a lot of those right, that's a good sign too, because it means you're engaged, it means your memory is solid, and you can recall the specific details, but be careful. One of the adjustments that you will want to try to make in doing this, especially if you find yourself being really successful with big and narrow questions, speed up. Instead of that extra 5 minutes, questions plus 5, give yourself an extra 3. Go back to Dave's +2 guideline for the passage. See how you do then, still not looking back into the text. If you can still do well on those specific questions, great. You're going to miss some because nobody can remember every piece of a passage. It's just impossible. But the more you speed up, you should still be able to get the big picture stuff right, those global questions. So this is a really interesting test for that. And I think it's just a different type of challenge, frankly. If you know that the passage is going to disappear, there's a degree of fear. It's a bit unnerving to feel like you've lost the text, but it is a very important way to measure how you're prioritizing things as you read. There was a question asked earlier that applies directly, I think, to the next test here, what we call a diagramming test. For anyone who's taken the digital test, obviously, or even played around with the digital interface, whether ours or Lsat's, wherever, you know that there are various tools you can use to diagram. There's 3 highlighters you can underline in the passage text, and you have scratch paper off to the side that you can make freehand notes on. You cannot annotate freehand on the passage itself, though. So all you can use on the passage are diagram tools built into the system, and then of course you can freehand write off to the side on scratch paper as you see fit. Here's the way that this test works. Do the standard +2 approach, as you can see in the timing paragraph here. So again, 6 questions is 8 minutes, and diagram through the passage or off the passage onto scratch paper as you normally would. In other words, treat it the same way you always do. Here's the catch to this particular test, though, and this is one where you have to keep yourself honest, frankly. As you move through the passage and diagram and then leave the passage into the questions, the only parts of the passage you are allowed to either return to, the only notes that you are allowed to use, are those that you have diagrammed as you went through it. If there's a paragraph you didn't touch or make a note about, you are not allowed to look at that paragraph again. See how you do in answering the questions with just your diagrams. Yeah, whether it's, again, off to the side, you've made notes, whether it's something in the passage, if you've got highlights, you can use them. If something's not underlined or highlighted in the passage, do not reread it. The analysis here is, I think, several-fold. There are multi-layers to what this is going to tell you. One is it's just going to give you a sense of whether you've diagrammed too little or too much. The more you focus on the elements you've diagrammed and how useful they were or not, the better gauge ultimately that you get. It calibrates your sense of the right amount for you. And it's going to be different for everyone. This is why people practice and test and experiment. I diagram relatively little, often not at all. Dave diagrams more, for instance. It's just the style that we've both chosen to adopt because we know what works for us and what's most comfortable. It's going to be different for everyone here, but this is a good way to simply measure your amount, the degree. Secondly, there's an interesting part of this too, where you will get a very clear sense very quickly of just how useful your diagrams, your notations were, given what you're asked after the fact. If you missed whole parts of the passage they asked a bunch of questions about, you're not allowed to look at them. You failed to catch them and diagram them originally. That's a problem. This test will reveal it to you. If you've diagrammed tons of the passage or written tons of notes that don't prove helpful, that's a great result too, because you'll be, again, able to recalibrate accordingly. So I think for most people, the temptation here, aside from reading beyond the diagrams, don't do that, is to go overboard. I better diagram this, otherwise I can't look at it. Don't do that. Try to make this, like I said, a representative effort. How am I going to do this on test day? What would I actually mark or notate? And that's what you want to try to use this test to measure. So if you find you're doing too much, whittle it down, and I think that's the case for most people. But also compare what you've diagrammed to what was ultimately useful, what was asked, and then again, adjust accordingly. Why did I miss this? Or why did I think this would matter? Those are key questions to ask here. Excellent. So those are the first two tests that we'll talk about. I'm going to let Dave actually jump in here and talk about a couple more for us. And then, like I said, I'll come back in and do a few more as well. So, Dave, if you want to hop on.
All right. So this is, I think, really a fascinating thing because I want to underline what John just said at the start of that conversation, which is that, sometimes reading comprehension is maybe not the most enjoyable section for the typical person out there. And I know tons of people who see RC come up and they think to themselves, it's a big groan. And one of the cool things here, and John pointed this out, is that these tests, they allow you to play with it. They allow you to do different things and not just the same passage and questions over and over and over again. And as you play around with it and examine different aspects, you learn. You get information back. And one of the things about LSAT preparation that is incredibly important is getting feedback. Sometimes it's external. Sometimes it's from the information you're learning as you're going through it. You never know, but wherever you can get information and feedback, it's going to typically be valuable. So each one of these tests teaches us something different about your personal approach and your strengths and weaknesses. Now, I've got two tests here that I'm going to talk about, and I find them to be a really interesting pair because they are diametrically opposed. So this is the yin and yang of the two, of all these different tests, the heaven and hell, one might say. So let's start off with what we call the comprehension test. And, the section's called reading comprehension, so you might imagine that this is a pretty important one overall. And if we're going to call it comprehension, you can also figure that this is going to be about how well you understand what it is that you have read. Now, from a timing standpoint, this is heaven. There is no time limitation. And a lot of people are like, whoa, this is great. This is going to be a lot of fun. That is not entirely the case. The reason there is no time limitation is because you're going to have to do some writing and summarization through the process. And so consequently, you're going to, stop really reading the passage or, thinking about the questions and instead write something completely separately. That gives us an idea of what it is that you've read. So that time limitation, when we say there is no limit, use some common sense about this. If somebody was said to me, I did a passage using the comprehension test and it took me 2 hours, I would say you probably wrote too much and maybe went a little bit too slow. So again, this is all about the idea of being reasonable in your approach. So how do we do it? All right, first off, you read the passage at your normal speed. So if you have if it takes you typically 5 minutes to read the passage, that's what your goal is. You're not trying to go super fast. You're not trying to go super slow. You're trying to go what you know to be pretty successful for you. Now, here's where you switch it up. At the conclusion of each paragraph, what you want to stop and do, and on a separate piece of paper, is write out a description of what it is that you read, a summary. It doesn't have to be a paraphrase of each line or idea that's in there. It's more about, I just read this paragraph, this is what it said to me. The key thing, though, is do not look back at the text. You have to do it from memory. And so it's a matter of kind of like, you have to use that short-term memory idea and your retention to then really regurgitate what it is that you see. And this really kind of, when students are forced to do this, they a lot of times begin to realize, I wasn't understanding what was said. Because eventually what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to compare what it is that you actually read to what it is that you wrote down. Now, you do that for each paragraph. That gives us kind of like a micro level view as you're going through the passage. But at the end, guess what? You're going to come back, and after you've written your description of the final paragraph, you're then going to kind of say, well, what did I think the overall picture was? What were the main points? Who were the big viewpoints that were out there? What was their attitude and tone and so forth? So you're doing a fair amount of writing, and really it's typing for most people, so a little bit faster. But I cannot overstress the importance of this. One of the things that we have advocated for years in logical reasoning is you have to paraphrase what you read, and you have to get a really accurate understanding of what they said. It doesn't have to be inch perfect, but it has to be pretty close, because the test just forces that upon people. It's the same thing in reading comprehension. And doing this in LR, and it's a great exercise for logical reasoning as well, or reading comprehension is hugely helpful because it will reveal very quickly what your strengths and weaknesses are, especially because the second part of this test is to go on to the questions and answer them using just what you wrote. Not the passage, but what you wrote. And for a lot of people, they're like, that's scary because I want to see what the test maker said. But that's what the test is here. We're comparing your perception and your recollection of what was said to what they actually said. And if it's really divergent, if it's far, far away, then you know you've got a problem. Either you have to slow down or you have to focus more while you're reading to make sure that you're actually getting their points. On the other hand, if it is really close, excellent. That actually tells us quite a bit that you're doing really well in terms of your reading. So that's the analysis point. One of the things that is really important, though, is to realize that you're going to miss questions, especially what we call specific reference questions. And those of you who are familiar with the system that we use know that we kind of look at reading comprehension questions as either being extremely specific to something in the text, specific reference, something that's kind of like a big idea but rather indistinct, kind of like a concept reference, or something that's really just drawn from the entire passage as a whole, like the main point, which we call a global reference question. Those are like the three levels of information that are floating around, which gives them a lot of places to attack you. But if you have written out all your summaries, and it took a while, and I appreciate the effort that you put in, and you did, your best possible job, now when you're answering the questions, you'll probably discover that the bigger picture ideas and the mid-level ideas are relatively easier to answer using your information. If something comes in and says, in line 15, the use of this word means the following, it's going to be tough because the way this test works, you don't get to go back to line 15. You have to just use your memory. But that's useful as well because you can see it's a short-term memory test. And the Lsat is definitely about short-term memory. If you've ever seen the movie Memento, he's got a problem. Yeah, he has only a short-term memory and then no real long-term memory. Here, you've got to have the same kind of short-term memory. You have to remember as much as possible, write it down, and then use just that. Now, if you want to adjust this test, there are various things you can do. You can force yourself to read faster and reduce the overall amount of time that you have. It's gonna cost you some questions probably because you'll get broader and broader in terms of what you've retained and what you end up writing down. But afterwards, the key is look over what you've done, compare it back line by line to what the passage did. You'll find out very quickly whether or not you're really getting the points. And I've had students do this before, both with logical reasoning and reading comprehension, and it dawns on them, I'm reading, but I'm not understanding or retaining. They're almost like speed reading. They're just burning through it because they're so worried about the clock that they've forgotten really what the main point of the whole process is, which is to understand. And this can be a really jarring thing at first. So like, what I wrote is not really that close, and they're a little depressed. And my reaction is always the same. Don't be depressed. Be excited. We just learned something huge about the way that you approach this exam. And now, because we know it's not where we want to be, we can set about fixing it. So I think that's really important. Don't get upset if you're like, I did terrible on this. Use that information for what it is. Valuable resource that you can then begin mining and correcting and fixing as you go forward. So obviously, comprehension is the name of the entire section. This is a key skill. To me, this is one of the most important tests to try. Unfortunately, it's also the most painful one in terms of the amount of time that it takes. Let's flip it over, though, and go to, the yang to this particular yin, the hell to the heaven that we just talked about. And that is what we call the speed test. So if comprehension was one thing, the opposite of it is speed. And I've said earlier already that to do well in this test, you have to kind of have both speed and accuracy. Comprehension tends to give you accuracy. Speed tends to take it away. So these two are really diametrically opposed. So let's go through this and see how this one works. This is very different. So the idea, we want to see how fast you can go. And a lot of times people say, well, that's the whole thing anyway. I'm already trying to go as fast as possible. But John's talked about this before in various places, and I know this is probably his favorite test overall. He's a speed demon. What he often says is that people tend to read in a way that is really just kind of casual and what they're used to. And what the speed test can do for you is prove whether or not that's the right pace. Maybe you can go faster, but you don't know it. Or maybe you're just going too fast already and it's out of control. This will help prove that. So what do we do from a timing standpoint? We're going to use the exact number of questions as the total time for you to read the passage and answer all the questions. So if you have a 8-question passage, you have 8 minutes. If you have a 6-question passage, you have 6 minutes. Read the passage and do the answers, do the questions, at least as many of them as you possibly can get to. Most of the time, you're going to discover that you're not going to finish everything. That's all right. In some cases, you might be surprised that you got further than you expected and did better than you actually thought. So that's an important point that we'll talk about. But as you go through it, do everything the way you normally would. Make any underlining or highlighting marks on the screen, make any side notes that you would, but be aware that you have to go faster. This is a true pressure test. The entire idea here is to put you under pressure and see if you will break or whether you will be able to kind of like skate through it. So keep that in mind. It's very tough. 6 minutes to do an entire passage and 6 questions, that's really brutal. So don't get depressed if you're like, I didn't do well at that. The point is not to be perfect. The point is to learn. So as we get into the analysis portion of this, and that's the very first thing that comes out of here is don't worry about the misses. And don't worry about the questions you didn't get to. If you didn't get to the last 2 questions, don't beat yourself up. I mean, you never had a chance. You didn't get to them, no worries. What you want to focus on is actually at the bottom of this paragraph. Focus on the questions that you completed. How did you do? If you did 5 questions out of 7 and you got all 5 right, you're telling yourself that you can actually perhaps read faster than you normally are used to. Next time, keep that same reading speed and give yourself the normal amount of time you might be able to get through all 7 questions in that passage. So that's really key. The other thing this does is it will force you to rely upon the basic approach that you use to analyze the contents of a passage. We use what's called view stamp, which is a mixture of various ideas, looking for viewpoints, looking for main points, looking for attitude, and so forth, really trying to see the structure of the passage as opposed to every single little detail of it. So because the speed test doesn't give you a huge amount of time, this is one way to see how good your view stamp analysis is. How good is your understanding of the structure of the passage? So obviously, the better view stamp that you can get and the better structural analysis that you have, usually the more successful you're going to be when you work through a passage. And of course, there's a huge benefit to all of this. You kind of really learn what your true pace is at the top level. What's the fastest I can go? Well, I couldn't do it. All right, we just got to slow down a little bit. How much we need to slow down is an adjustment. You'll never know how fast your car goes until you really hit the accelerator all the way to the floor, which I've only done a few times, and the adrenaline rush is pretty awesome. I don't know if you're going to get the same thing here in reading comprehension, but it is kind of terrifying to be forced to go super fast and then to see what happens. And at the worst, that can be kind of fun. It's relatively quick exercise, 6-minute passage and questions. All right, that was crazy. Gets you enjoying it, gets you having fun with what you're doing, and it helps you to learn how the process is actually going. If you need to make adjustments, and a lot of times people do, especially after the first or second time they do this, they're like, I need more time, and that's okay. Add some time to that. The one thing I will say is if you don't get any questions, or if you don't get to a couple of questions at the end, go back and do them when this is all done and see how you've done. There's nothing wrong with completing everything and kind of looking inside each of the problems as much as you can. But the goal here is less to worry about the mechanics of their questions and more to worry about the mechanics of how you're approaching things. This will show your true pace. It'll overdrive you, and how you perform under those overdriven conditions can be really interesting and informative. It might even reveal that for some test takers out there, they could go faster and still be just as successful as they are going more slowly. You got to try it to know whether or not it's possible. All right, on that note, I'm going to pass it back to John and let him take over the last two tests. John?
Awesome. Thanks. I love hearing this speed test talked about. As Dave mentioned, it's probably my favorite one in here, although the next two that I'm going to cover are contenders for that title as well. Let me make two more quick points to what he said here. One is to echo the idea that I think people are very often surprised at just how fast they can go and still maintain accuracy. If you can trade very little accuracy loss for more questions done, that's a beautiful trade. That's the type of calculus, the balance that you want to strike here. So push yourself, overdrive it. I wrote an actual page or article in one of the latest editions of the Reading Comprehension Bible where I specifically talk about this. I think I called it something like the nexus of speed and accuracy, or like leaving your comfort zone behind on occasion, just to see what that extra pace feels like. What would it be like if I only gave myself 5 minutes for these 6 questions? What's that experience like, and what results do I get, especially as I continue to push myself and practice it? The second comment that I'll make, and this is a little bit more broad, any of these tests where you can see they're fairly rigorously timed, time yourself incrementally as well. Not just, all right, I had plus 2 minutes, there were 8 questions, I got 10, I finished in 9.5. But see where you are as you actually move through the passage set. How long did it take you to read the passage and then move into the first question? Were there any questions there that took 1.5 or 2 minutes? That's a problem. So if you've got these more granular measurements through the passage set itself, not only can you identify your overall speed and pace, but you can start to see where time is lost and thus might be gained as you learn more and you develop your skills. So I'm going to talk about 2 more things here. It's funny, Dave just talked about 2 that are, in a way, almost in opposition of one another. The next 2 that I'm going to talk about are siblings. They are very, very close in terms of what they're actually trying to determine and measure for you. And the first one is something I'm going to call the prediction test. Here's the idea. As you begin to move through a passage, what you want to ultimately be able to do, best you can, is anticipate not just what content in the passage is going to matter the most. That's what the diagramming test was meant to show, the summary test that we call Comprehension Test. That's what all of that's meant to measure. But you also want to see if you can better anticipate and predict what the test makers are going to ask you about that passage. Were there viewpoints, specific examples? Was there a list? What are the things within this passage that tend to generate the questions? And can I see those elements when I encounter them and predict the questions that are going to come? This is another test with the +2 timing, so pretty much your normal speed here. The goal is that as you move through the passage, you make your notations, you diagram, you scratch paper. After you do all of that, begin to actually note what you think is going to be asked. Start to see how many of the questions that follow you can predict with some degree of accuracy. Again, competing viewpoints, they're probably going to ask you about that. Expect it, anticipate it. And then as you actually move into the questions and begin to read the question's stem, compare your expectations, your predictions, to what actually occurred. This is an incredibly useful exercise. If you can start to see the questions before you've been asked them, especially as you're reading in real time, it makes everything so much clearer. As I've explained to people before, if you can get good at this, and I promise, guys, with practice, you can, it almost feels like when you start a reading comp passage, you've been handed like the annotated teacher's edition of the Lsat. It begins to immediately take on almost topography, where certain things stand out from the rest. There's hills and valleys of significance as you read. It's a beautiful, beautiful feeling to move through it with that degree of future certainty, that degree of almost clairvoyance. And that's what you're ultimately trying to measure as you perform your analysis of the results. It's not so much about getting the questions themselves right here, although always a goal, but more about seeing the questions in advance based off of what the passage itself did. And there's a secondary adjustment, if you could call it that you can make here, which is once you've completed a set of questions, no matter how accurate or not your predictions of them were, reverse engineer it. Go back to the questions themselves and start to think to yourself, how could I have seen this coming? Two of these questions asked about the second half of paragraph 3. I didn't even realize that was going to be important. Why didn't I? How could I have? Why didn't I highlight or notate that? Why didn't I catch it as I read? This is what I mean by reverse engineering, literally having the questions after the fact show you what the test makers considered to be the most worthwhile portions of that passage. Do that enough time, it's amazing. Like I say, it's amazing how much you can anticipate with accuracy, with confidence, and it completely changes the dynamic of how you read a passage itself. You'll read and be like, this is all garbage, this is filler. Okay, this is really going to matter. You can start to see those highlights in advance. It's beautiful, beautiful. And that's what we mean by the prediction test, trying to figure out what questions they're going to ask you about the passage. The related, and the final test that I'm going to talk about, related test has to do with predicting answer choices. Predicting questions from the passage in the last one, and then from those questions, when you go into them, trying to prephrase what the correct answer choice is going to either be or do in terms of accomplishment. What's great about this particular test as well is that it's not just a reading comprehension specific test. You can do this in logical reasoning. In fact, you should be doing this in logical reasoning as an exercise. So this might be the most global of all in terms of its broad section applicability. I love this idea. Here's how it works. Again, this is one where there's no real time limit to it because the point isn't speed, it's the accuracy of your anticipations, of your predictions, in this case, towards the answer choices themselves. The way that I used to describe this to people back in the old physical test days when you had a paper booklet is I would take a stack of Post-it notes and I would take a logical reasoning section or a reading comp section. And I would go through, and before I even looked at any of it, I would just cover up every set of answer choices through the whole section, passage set, whatever I was about to do. Do it in advance. And then I would start to work through that section. So if it's reading comprehension, read the passage, go to the first question. And on top of that Post-it note, I would actually write down my prephrase. They're asking me the main point. Here's what I think the answer is going to at least include. This would help me, I think, in finding the right answer choice among these 5. And I would do it over and over. And at the end of however much content I intended to practice, I would go back, peel that first Post-it, stick it next to the answers, and without rereading anything, see if my prephrase was good enough to choose an answer choice. And then see, of course, if I got it right. Over and over and over. It's a little harder to apply that physical barrier to visibility when it comes to a digital test. But there are still ways you can do it. You could technically put Post-it notes on your tablet, your computer screen. That would work. You could cover the answers with your hand, which I've seen a lot of people do, or just look away, literally spin around in their chair, and then write out question 1, prediction. Just some short notes, whatever the prephrase might be. Sometimes, guys, you're going to find you can do this with tremendous accuracy and precision. A main point question, author's attitude or tone, the purpose of paragraph 4. These are often things where you can see more or less verbatim what the test makers are likely to say. The problem is that not every question type is going to allow for that same degree of certainty or precision, and that's okay. If it's a weekend question, say, it might be that the best you can do for weekend, if the author thinks this plan's a terrible idea, is say, show benefit of plan. That's a great prephrase. Do we know what that benefit's going to be? No, but you can at least anticipate the nature, the function of a correct answer choice in situations like that, and that's incredibly powerful too. So the goal here isn't always to be perfectly precise. The goal is to give yourself a lens, a better lens through which to view the answer choices so that the right answer stands out even further from the competition. That's what prephrasing is all about. How do you analyze this? A lot like the last test, you check your accuracy. You start to see, are my prephrases matching up to the correct answer choices? Again, either in terms of the wording, the language, or in terms of the function, the accomplishment of that answer choice. If it's a yes, congratulations, keep it up. If it's a no, or you find that there's some discrepancy, or I wrote this thing and expected something that didn't happen, or wasn't helpful, or wildly missed what the test makers ultimately did, that's a real opportunity too. Because it gives you a chance, like I said before, to recalibrate, to adjust your own expectations as you go, and get closer in line with what the test makers are doing, so that on test day, you can start to see right answer choices before you've even read them. That's the goal. Prediction test gives you the questions in advance. Prephrasing gives you the correct answer choice in advance. But make this a hard, well-determined, preordained kind of process. Cover those answers. Don't let yourself cheat. Use your prephrase as the guide and see how you do. And again, you can reverse engineer this after the fact. All right, D's the right answer. I didn't see that coming. Why did I miss that they were going to say this? Why did I miss that I didn't realize an alternate cause would hurt this author's conclusion down here, would weaken it? That's a real opportunity, like I said, to tighten up, to more closely align with what the test makers are doing. So these last two tests that I've just described are both extremely powerful. You get good at these two skills, especially in concordance with one another, and it feels like walking through the dark woods and someone hands you a flashlight or something. Suddenly everything's illuminated, you can see you're not going to fall in that ditch. It's a beautiful experience. But you have to practice this, and again, you have to make it a hard, well-determined type of practice. These are not loose tests, these last two. Perfect. So, the idea here in each of these guys is that there is no order in which you need to apply these tests. There is no perfect amount or volume in which you apply these tests. Prephrase every third passage set kind of thing. That's not how this works. Instead, it's more about giving yourself an entire arsenal, an entire toolkit through which you can make a better self-diagnosis if you find yourself struggling, or perhaps even realize you have certain, call them illnesses, that you weren't even aware of. These tests often reveal that too, underlying conditions that would have escaped your notice but now allow opportunities to improve. That's how I see it. In talking a little bit more about that application idea, I'm going to turn it back to Dave, let him close us out here, because I know he has some thoughts, some good thoughts, on exactly how these tests are best implemented, short and long term. So Dave, take us home, my man.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Let's hope they are good thoughts. Try to make it that way. So we've just talked about all these tests, and the natural question is well, what do I do? How do I work with these? What happens when I learn certain things from these tests? And so the typical person who is preparing for this exam will discover somewhere in all these different tests that they have some issues. And part of the process of getting better is to practice. And so I always say to people, don't do these tests just one time. Don't do it one passage to be like, oh, I need to be better at comprehension, or I need to be better at speed. It doesn't work that way. Any individual event can have a lot of variance to it. So what you want to do instead is you want to kind of practice with it multiple times. John kind of alluded to that, where he said there's not some regimen that says every third time you do a passage set, it's prephrasing. Sometimes people will do the same test over and over to try to see if they can improve just in the short term. Sometimes they'll vary it from one to the other. But the key thing is that in your practice with reading comprehension, work with real passages. Do as many of the passages out there that you can. Do as many of the questions that you can. And it is okay for you to burn some of the reading comprehension passages out there using these particular tests on them. And so one of the things that we recommend that you do is that you use these tests as basic drills. There are so many reading comprehension passages, and so few people get through all of them that I'm not even at all worried about someone saying, I used 10 of these tests, 10 full exams, 40 passage sets, and I did a number of these drills on it. That's fine with me, because what that is saying is you just did 40 grueling reading comp passages and question sets, and you learned from them. You examined what you were doing. And this is the life examined. You have to learn from how you perform, from watching yourself, from your strengths and weaknesses, the mistakes that you actually make. As I said earlier, and John certainly said as well, these help make things a little bit more fun. It mixes up reading comp in a way that you don't often get. It took me a long time to kind of come to the conclusion. It was like just doing passages themselves is nice, but with reading comp, it can get so boring that you start to lose your mind. No one ever sits down and says to me, I just did 20 reading comp passages in a row. And if they did, I'd be like, we need to check you into a mental hospital. But I've had people come in and be like, I just did 20 games in a row. Also overkill, but I've heard it a lot more than I've ever heard someone say that about reading comp. However, I've worked with students who are like, oh, it was fun. I did this, then I tried this, and I was able to stop and slowly analyze myself. But the key thing is use these on passages, maintain a positive attitude, and do them as drills. And don't forget also that you need to, every once in a while, mix in full sections and full tests. I'm a big believer that you have to put yourself under the clock and do a rigorous simulation every once in a while. Not every day, not every other day, but certainly with some frequency. And if reading comprehension has been a weakness on this test for you, you can improve. But to improve, you have to know where your problems are. And the whole goal of this seminar is to say, hey, these are some diagnostic tests that you can run on yourself and hopefully learn where some of your weaknesses are, and then attack that through as much practice as possible. So practice with these, play around with these ideas, try to keep it fresh, mix it up. Don't get too worried when you make mistakes. Be positive about it and realize that every time you make an error, it is an opportunity to learn. It's one of the most important things I ever learned in my life was that if you fail, all right, I just learned another thing that didn't work. So when you get to the very end of the line and you're trying to make sure that you really understand everything, though, there's actually one more test that we have. It's probably my favorite of all the tests, and it's one that I advocate very frequently. As you kind of approach that final run to the exam, or at least where you feel like you're starting to get pretty good at reading comprehension or you're starting to improve, one of the final ways that we really check how you're performing and how good you are is we use what's called the teaching test. And this is one of my favorite things. And it's built on the idea that if you are a true master of something, you will be able to teach it to somebody else in a logical and cohesive way. And so this is a really simple idea, although it can be a little daunting at times for people, and it can feel a little bit challenging. But the gist of it is to come down and say to yourself, could you effectively teach this to somebody else? Could you explain this passage and the correct approach to it? Could you explain each of these answers to somebody and why each answer is incorrect or why that answer happens to be correct? Well, that's one thing you can ask yourself as you're kind of going through everything. Like, could I do it? But of course, I always say asking yourself isn't really the truth. The real truth is doing it. And so to me, one of my favorite things when students are studying is, especially like you get a study buddy, you've got friends, is to try to have them do a passage and then you explain it to them. And this works for almost anything. It works certainly for logical reasoning and logic games, but it works for 100 other things in life as well. And so as you kind of work through this particular idea, this is the proof. This is the definitive answer as to whether or not you really know something. Have somebody do the passage, sit down and explain it to them. You'll very quickly understand whether or not you have good organization of the ideas and whether or not you have weaknesses. And, in logical reasoning, you might try to explain conditional reasoning to somebody and discover, I don't really know that particular idea. I need to go back and look at it. Same thing happens here in reading comprehension. Teaching it to somebody else is the ultimate proving ground to tell yourself whether or not you really know it. Now, sometimes people are like, no way, dude. I am not going to do that. All right, I understand that. But then at least try to be as honest with yourself as possible about whether or not you understand the ideas. If you really think that you can teach somebody else, maybe verbalize it, almost like you were practicing a speech. Like, well, this is how I would explain it. And if you say to yourself, I don't understand it as well as I should, go back and review it some more. Honesty in your studying is one of the most important things in the world, because sometimes people are like, well, it'll just work out. I'm all about having plans. I want to know what's going to happen if things go right, but I also really want to know what's going to happen if things go wrong. And one of the things about the teaching test is it removes any false illusions you might have. It will prove to you, hey, I really did know that game. I really did know that passage. And that by itself is an incredibly positive sense of mastery. You think about self-confidence on this exam, and John and I, certainly in our podcast, have talked about how important it is. Teaching it to somebody else and having them understand it and knowing that you did a pretty good job, you'll walk away thinking, I'm getting better at this. I'm improving. And every day, if you can improve just a little bit, that's a successful day when it comes to this exam. Because there are days when I know people have had, and they're like, I don't know what happened today. I don't learn anything. Hopefully you still did, but your goal is learn something new every day about the exam. Get a little bit better as you go through things. So that is our final test that's out there. And hopefully this seminar has given you the opportunity to kind of like think about the way that you analyze reading comprehension and to give you some tools that allow you to examine your performance, look at the facets of it, and hopefully down the line reveal the strengths and weaknesses that you have so that you can work on those and get better. So on behalf of John and myself, we've got a couple things we want to mention that relate to this idea, and then we'll probably go ahead and take some questions afterwards. But both John and I and Adam really appreciate you being here tonight. The first thing I want to mention is that, as I said at the beginning of this seminar, all the information that we had on the screen comes from the old Reading Comprehension Bible. Although I should really say it's new, because this book has changed tremendously in just the last year and a half to 2 years, as we've really kind of upgraded everything that we're doing. And right now, if, because of the virus situation, we've put in big discounts on a lot of our courses and our books. So if you were thinking about purchasing one of them, that's available to you right now. We're going to keep those in place throughout the duration of the COVID situation that we're all kind of being forced to deal with right now. So that's something to think about. I also want to mention, since a lot of people are at home, that we have courses that are online. That says in-person here, and I have a little laugh because not right now. There are no in-person courses that are operational. We're fortunate to be able to put everything online and in on demand. So plenty of classes starting basically every couple of days at this point. We added a bunch of classes because we knew everyone was going to be home studying. And hopefully that's something that if you are interested in, give us a call, ask us questions about it. The kind of things that John and I have been talking about tonight are exactly the kind of things that we talk about in our classes. Some of the content here we use for a module in our live online classes, something that we do every Friday. We have basically like kind of like an office hours thing where we go over various topics. So this is very much the way we like to teach the Lsat. These are the types of concepts that we like to talk about. So if you have any questions about the books, the courses, or really just anything related to the Lsat itself, feel free to contact us. Our office is technically open, meaning people will answer the phone. They are not in the office. They are at home. We sent them home, obviously, several weeks ago when we realized how serious the situation was. But they are there and available. They might be sitting in their living room, but they would love to speak with you if you do have any questions, and they can help you on a variety of levels with not just the Lsat, but law school admissions, you name it. So I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. I realize that times are strange, so please be safe out there. Stay away from other people. And at this point, we'll close out the seminar itself, but we'll take questions if anybody has anything that they want to ask that is about RC or about something else, we're here for you. So thanks, everybody. Much appreciated. Have a great evening and stay safe.